attendees today. It's going to be a sunny day here in Northern California, in Dublin, in the East Bay where we live. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar on building a modern contract management strategy. I'm your host. My name is Indus Khaitan, and I head marketing at Serion Labs. Joining me today are two expert speakers from Forrester and Serion Labs. Before we begin, quick housekeeping items. As you already know, the webinar slides, a copy of the recording, and the Q&A here at the end will be emailed to you. Get familiar with your GoToWebinar panel. You could use it for queuing the questions in the chat window, or you could ask any technical problems which you may have. You could also follow us on Twitter at Serion Labs. Use the hashtag contract management. I'll be monitoring the Twitter feed and may queue up your questions from there to the panelists here. With that, introducing our speakers, I have Andrew Bartels. Andrew is a Vice President and Principal Analyst at Forrester. And I also have Ajay Agrawal, the CEO and co-founder of Serion Labs. Quickly moving to the agenda and what we are going to cover today. In brief, we're going to walk on the context and landscape of CLM, the contract lifecycle management, and why it is critical for contract management. We're going to dig deeper into the insights and gaps in traditional CLM approach and the results which we see or do not see in terms of value leakage. Andrew and Ajay are also going to touch upon the best practices in leveraging the modern CLM technology for effective contract management. And then, of course, Ajay is going to dig deeper into how Sirion is transforming the way enterprises manage contracts. With that, I have Andrew. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Indus, and good afternoon to those of you in the U.S., at least west of the Mississippi. I'm actually calling in from cloudy Long Island, so not quite as sunny as California. The topic, as we indicated, is about why contract management is a must in today's procurement world. And the the basic theme of this is that contracts play a central role in purchasing today. Now, this has not always been the case. In much of history, business relationships were done orally and sealed with a handshake. But in today's modern world, where buyers and suppliers may not ever come face to face, and where they often have complex relationships, the contract becomes the central role in that relationship. It is the result of some kind of a sourcing event where the buyers and suppliers agree as to who's going to be chosen as supplier and what the price is going to be. That gets turned into a contract, and then it gets executed through procurement and through other systems, and then paid off using an invoice. But you also have situations where you have an existing contract, and that existing contract then triggers a sourcing event. So contracts play a central role in purchasing in terms of governing the relationship that companies have with their key strategic suppliers. Now, contracts themselves have their own life cycle. And that life cycle requires a specialized solution that can handle all the stages of that life cycle. In principle, then contracts start with the drafting negotiation of a contract. But contracts can also arise in which you are the recipient of a contract from your counterparty, and you have to deal with that counterparty's contracts and work from that. Whether it's your own contract or it's a third-party contract, you then want to have that contract accessible in a repository, or it can be stored and accessed. But of course, contract signing is not the end of the deal. You have to have systems that allow you to manage that contract, to look for contract compliance, look for making sure you're getting what you getting what you expected from the contract, and you're delivering what your contract promised you would deliver. But contracts themselves should not be viewed as static documents. You want to utilize your contract to understand what you're getting. Is the contract delivering the business results that you expected? Or does it need to be modified or changed to reflect goals that you'd like to have the contract deliver that you didn't anticipate and should be in the contract? That means you want to optimize the contract. And of course, every contract, well, I won't say every contract, most contracts have an expiration date. And so you need to be prepared for that and decide, do we want to continue the contract and renew it, or do you want to replace it? And these 6 stages of a contract lifecycle require, in our view, a technology solution that we at Forrester call Contract Lifecycle Management, or CLM, that's able to handle all the stages of that lifecycle and make sure that firms get the benefit of that contract and its terms throughout their buying process and their buying activities. Now, what we have found in working with dozens of clients and working with dozens of vendors and working with over a lot of time of this, is that contracts can be, or CLM solutions can be thought as delivering 5 sources of value, which tend to reflect the 5 stages of value we talked about earlier, but also in a sense are the 5 stages of implementation. So the first stage of value comes from having all your contracts in an electronic repository. There the benefit lies in being able to cut the cost of finding contracts, cut the cost of having contracts that expire that you did not want to expire because they were really good ones, or automatic renewing contracts that you didn't want to renew. So right now in many cases today, if firms are trying to manage contracts, they have to call down to legal and say, can you pull that contract and send it to me so I can see what we're supposed to do? And obviously there's a cost associated with that. So having all your contracts in an electronic repository where they're accessible with the right controls to the right people who need that contract information, that's a major source of value of any CLM solution. But just the first of it. The second source of value lies in being able to look at your total contract portfolio, to see the duplicates, to see the conflicts, to see the contract terms that are missing that you want to have in there, to see all of the obligations you might have across contracts and what that might mean from a financial perspective, what payments you have to be making, and similarly see what rights you have in the contracts so you can understand what we should be entitled to, what we should be getting in the way of supplier or partner delivery against that. And this is another source of value from CLM, is be able to do those kinds of reports, do those kinds of analysis, using a combination of reporting, of pre-built, pre-packaged reports you get out of solution, but also being able to run or generate custom reports that look at different items that or issues or things that you might want to see. If there's a change, for example, in the broader business environment, you want to see which of our contracts might be impacted by that. A new tax law, for example, or new requirements regarding invoicing or any other new legal change, understand immediately what the impact of that is on your contract portfolio is. A major benefit of CLM lies in the contract creation. Rather than having legal have to draft every single contract, and legal have to review every stage of the negotiation or the modification of that contract, instead allowing them to define the parameters, define the terms and conditions that go into contracts, to build into the solution rules as to what terms and conditions can be changed or what can't be changed, but then allow a business user to go into the system, identify the business need, enter in the few relevant points of information, choose the right contract, and have that generate for them without legal involved. That's a tremendous savings of time. And if they make changes as they might in negotiation, to then allow legal to only have to be involved if those changes are in language that's important to legal. And allow them, when that happens, to immediately zoom in, see it, approve it or not approve it, instead of having to review every contract to make sure it's in compliance. So major savings in legal staff time, major savings in cycle time, and of course with cycle time, acceleration of revenues or savings you're expecting to get for your contract. The fourth area of value lies in more automated compliance. By integrating your contract systems into your transaction systems, you can make sure that you are in fact complying with those contracts, or your counterparties are complying with those contracts. For example, by integrating CLM into your procurement system, when an employee generates a requisition, you can then have the system check, do we have a contract with a supplier for this category that's being purchased? Is the employee making purchasing of the items specified in the contract? Is the price being charged in conformity with the contract? Is the service being offered in conformity with the contract? And have that all done automatically within the system, so you're ensuring full compliance that way. And the fifth stage of value comes when you start looking at and analyzing what's the business value we're getting from our contracts and the business process we have for contracting, and how can that be improved? Where we finding we have in fact made contracts that are missing key fields, key terms, key conditions that will cause us pain we need to correct. How can our contract process be improved so we can close contracts more efficiently? Fewer touches, more automation along the way, and lower cost of doing that, faster cycle time. So those are 5 sources of value of CLM that occur. Oops, sorry. But the reality we found in looking at and talking to many clients, in this case, a series of structured interviews we did last year with 41 clients of different CLM solutions, we found that most firms have reached that first stage of getting a contracts in the repository. It's not simple, but they've got there. And most 72% have actually started doing contracts reports and analysis. And over half the firms have actually been authoring and negotiating contracts using the system. But when you get down to the post-signing stages, the integration with external systems, the integration with sibling apps, like CLE sourcing for buy-side contracts, or configuration pricing quoting with sell-side contracts, much lower levels of adoption. In terms of full contract optimization, again, low levels of adoption. This is probably even on the optimistic side because we're really talking about basic level of optimization. So the real opportunity for firms is to be able to move beyond the first 3 stages and get to the later stages. But that's not simple. It's when you move from that first stage, where you're simply reducing the cost and effort in contracts and being able to find them, to that second stage, the later stages, it's third and fourth stage, where you're driving success through your contract engagement, through improved business outcomes, through contract management, and through improving your contracts. You move from CLM as tactical and transactional to CLM as being strategic and transformational. That's when you maximize your strategic value, and yet that's what many firms have not yet been able to do. And that's what we're going to talk about, how you can move to that next stage. Now, this slide may look like it's coming out of left field, and to a degree it is. But the reason that contracts are becoming more and more important is the growing importance of services spending. When you buy a good, you do obviously want to have a contract that governs what you bought and how the price, but the good itself is not really in question. You kind of know what you're going to get. But when you buy a service, the service delivery is the heart of the value. And so how that service delivery manifests itself becomes a key contract issue. And services spending is a big deal. Across all industries in the U.S., 58% of purchased inputs in 2015 went for various categories of services. And in some industries, like finance and professional services and information services, or healthcare, is 2/3 or 3/4 of spending was on services. So contracts in the context of services are a big deal. And it's in the later stages, those stages of contract optimization, contract management, that the role of CLM really comes into the fore. As I said, in goods, a lot of that comes in getting the contract, and that's a simple matter of managing that. But in services, it's actively and aggressively managing those back-end processes where the value of CLM really comes to the fore. So here's some of the ways in which failure to manage that contract can really, come back and be a pain. In services, you will start by defining the service to be provided, and then you'll choose a vendor and specify in the contract the scope, the pricing, and timing of services to be provided. You'll engage with that service provider to initiate the work. You'll manage that service provider's performance during the engagement. At the end of it, you'll process an invoice and pay the vendor. But what happens if the invoice doesn't agree with the contract? That can happen a lot. What happens if the work itself starts to veer from the contract? What happens if the work performance doesn't meet the contract specifications or your own expectations? So if you're not tying the contract to each of these stages after the contract's signed, then you're losing value. In fact, you can see as much as 5 to 10% of the value of a contract, especially in services contracts, being lost because of slippage in these stages of managing the contract and optimizing the contract once it's been signed. So in this changed procurement environment, this environment in which services loom large, in which the focus increasingly has been not just getting the low-cost provider, but getting the best provider, the one who gives you the most value, then contract management must take a series of steps to really improve its operations to meet these new requirements. You've got to go beyond the traditional pre-signature focus to cover the full life cycle. It's not just a matter of we've got a contract in place and everything is good. You've got to be able to manage that contract aggressively through its life to make sure you're getting what you paid for, especially in the context of services agreements. You want to make sure that contract is going to enable and secure the intended business outcomes. With services in particular, there's a deliverable, and you want to make sure that deliverable meets your expectations, indeed exceeds your expectations, and you've got to manage against that using the contract. You want to make sure that you are handling risk management throughout the duration of the engagement. Again, with services, you may have a multi-month, sometimes even multi-year engagement. And throughout that, there's the risk that can arise. It could be that some of the employees of the vendor lose their certification, and you now have a risk that someone who's working for you doesn't have the right credentials. There could be changes in the vendor itself that bring the project risk. So you want to have risk management throughout that. Because these engagements run over time, they also cut across internal silos. So your solution needs to make sure it touches on and supports and enables your legal department and maybe your supply chain group and your IT group and your CPO, as well as anyone from the supplier who's working on this, so that information is shared, the key contract terms are accessible, everybody knows what is supposed to be done and who's doing that. You want a solution that can cut across those silos and support that collaboration engagement. And increasingly, in a world where analytics is becoming more and more embedded in the business we do, where workflows become a key aspect and where integration with other systems is a requisite, you want to have intelligent dynamic technology that has those analytics, that supports the workflows and can integrate with the other transaction systems that need contract data or may provide information about performance that you can evaluate in the contract system to see whether it meets your requirements. Now, what we're starting to see around contract management is the emergence of some advanced features. Here are some examples of what these advanced features are starting to look like. In the contract repository, for example, one of the key tasks of any contract, any CLM system, is to be able to find and extract key data. And often that is then structured into metadata categories. Now, for example, when you're importing a third-party contract, using machine learning to quickly be able to find, here's the pricing field in that, here's the SLA field, here's the indemnity clause, and do that automatically and naturally instead of having a person do it. That's an advanced feature we're seeing. Starting to be able to do analysis of actual performance, pulling in data from other transaction systems so you can see whether you're getting the expected result and then utilizing that against invoices. So you can check that the invoices are matching with the performance, with matching with the contract. CLM, as I said, allows enablers, allows end users to choose the right contract terms. But if you can provide an artificial intelligence that helps that user do a better job of choosing the right terms, choosing the right contract for the specific contract, that's another advanced feature we're seeing here that can help you get better contracts from the beginning and then better performance. Obviously, integration with transaction systems is a key element of contract management. But remember, contracts will always create exceptions, and you have workflow that will allow you to handle those exceptions, to track the obligations, to track the current status. So adding workflow into the integration is a key piece there. And increasingly, analytics that can point to new risks you hadn't thought about, or lost value you hadn't been aware of from your existing contracts, and identify the necessary changes to contract language to mean the next time you do a contract, it's a better contract, delivers better results. That's again what advanced CLM is looking like. So here are some success factors. You want obviously a good portfolio of existing out-of-the-box reports. You want contracts by spend, by geography, by renewal date. You want reports on contracting process and cycle time, where your bottlenecks are, where your delays in the contracting process. You want to be able to do compliance analysis reporting. They'll be able to take existing contracts, pull data from transaction systems about actual performance, and then use that to see where you're getting contract leakage, contract sub-performance. Having a dashboard that enables a contract manager or any business executive to monitor the status of service levels, obligations, governance, action items is another thing you want to have. And of course, not every report you can think of you can anticipate. So you want to have wizards to allow business users to generate the reports they may need without having to go to IT or someone else to do that. For contract compliance, I've alluded several times to automated workflows you'd want to have to track your service levels and track performance obligations. Because there will be exceptions, and you want to be able to have that. You want to have performance and invoice validation done automatically as much as possible, but of course understand that you'll never get 100%, and that's where workflows come back in. You want to be able to track your obligations at a very granular level to make sure you're getting compliance against policy and against external regulations. You want to be able to manage and track all your governance issues, all your action items, so that you can look at this both at a single vendor level or look across vendors to see what are the issues we're finding across our vendors we need to address. Of course, you don't want contracts to expire without you knowing about it. So alerts and reminders that come enough time for you to anticipate that contract renewal, decide whether it's a good idea or not, or to let it expire and initiate a new one. And then change management that will allow you to keep the contract metadata and obligations up to date with what may be happening in the business. Because again, business changes, and those business changes will have to flow back into your contracts. And around contract optimization, first of all, make contract improvement a goal. Many firms have just said, look, the contract's in place, it's working. But the goal, end goal, one of the key goals of this is to get better contracts. And that means it's got to be a priority. You've got to be thinking ahead. So you want to be turning the analytics that you have in your product or creating new analytics will allow you to identify the bottlenecks, the weak controls in your process, or the weak controls in the contract terms that you can then use to improve it. And above all, compare the actual results for the contracts with what you got to make sure you got what you expected. And if you didn't, figure out why not and bring that back to the contract improvement stage. Now, when investing in CLM, of course, we want to know what's the ROI for that, what's the return of investment. So I've tried to give here some simple areas to look for. There's certainly the hard savings, the reduction in supplier invoice amounts, the enforcement of service level credit so you can track supplier performance. There's business outcomes. You're improving your service delivery and performance because you're using your contracts, and you're closing contracts more rapidly so you can get revenues, if it's a sales side contract, done this quarter or not, and not next quarter. Over to the savings one, you start getting those savings, this week and not next month. Risk reduction. What are the risks you've been exposed to as a company from the contracts, and how can you reduce those? And what's the effort and cost you have? What's the savings you can get in terms of finding contracts, in terms of the legal department reviewing contracts, in terms of the number of unintentionally lapsed or renewed contracts, and in the reduction in the cost of managing those contracts manually without the advantage of these systems. So use this to put together your ROI. So those are my key thoughts about where contract management plays a role, what you need to look for today in advance in the CLM system, how you build your ROI, and how you look to use contract management to improve your contracts, and by doing so, improve the results of your purchasing process. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ajay, who's going to add his perspective to this issue.
Thank you, Richard, for wonderful and eye-opening insights, stats, and best practices. I'm going to talk briefly today about the experience that we've had here at Serion Labs over the past 5 years. As you very correctly observed in your talk, Andrew, the key problem is the lack of value realization, particularly in services contracts. In fact, our research, which is put together on facts from McKinsey, from Ernst & Young, PwC, etc., indicates that more than $200 to $300 billion of value is being lost annually due to lack of effective oversight of services contracts. And this is taking into account both the buy side and the sell side value leakage. So with that kind of brief preface, Sirion was put together by services contracts experts, to attack this problem statement, to use, really our key approach is to use the signed contract as a source of truth to delineate what is supposed to happen, then to go into the myriad of performance data sources, and I will touch on that in a little more detail, and algorithmically reconcile those to the contract to determine what actually happened. and to contrast that with what was inside the contract, and thereby arrive at a point where we can sit down and see the delta between the two and audit the invoices automatically. Along this journey, we have tried to automate as much as possible of the manual effort that's involved. What has been very interesting for us in this journey is how this has been responsive to buy-side clients across all industry sectors, whether they are from the private sector or the public sector. And what's also been fascinating is the broad range of services, which you can see on the right-hand side, which have proved amenable to this kind of technique of reconciling the contract mathematically to these sources of performance data. Next. So with this said, today where we stand as a company is we have a little more than 3 billion of TCV under management, which includes about 10,000 plus contracts and an underlying total of more than 350,000 obligations which are being managed. During calendar 2016, which was, I should mention this, only the second year of operation of Sirion as a product. The product itself was launched only in Jan 2015. So in our second year of operation, we were able to audit altogether about $1 billion of invoices, and our clients spotted discrepancies in those invoices, order of magnitude about 110 million, so about 11% of contract value. And from that 110, we're successful in reducing the actual invoice amount by about 68 million, or about just a shade under 7% of the annual contract value. Now, these are very substantial numbers, back to what Andrew had mentioned earlier. And if one moves forward and sees the causes of some of this, it becomes apparent that in most of the clients who we were working with, their primary focus prior to engaging with Sirion lay in the green circles, which is in the authoring, renewal, and termination side of things, which was their business as usual, if you will. And by engaging with Sirion more deeply, they were able to go deeper into aspects of performance, relationship, and even invoice management, which is where the kind of, if you will, life after signature, if I can call it that, came into focus for them. And and this approach, when you club it together with the other point that Andrew had mentioned, which is of distinguishing the narrowly legalistic approach to the broader business approach inside contracting, really helped our clients to start focusing on the hard leakage and the soft leakage. So the industry stats here are broadly, and this again comes from a variety of sources like McKinsey, PwC, EY, even some of the Forrester research out there, suggests that on an average, approximately 20% of the value of services contracts is being leaked today, a combination of hard and soft. And I gave you some statistics on the hard leakage recovery using Sirion. Some of the most interesting signals that you can start seeing is, in inefficient contract environment, is outdated contract documents in the repository, or unsigned ones, or incomplete contract trees, the deliverables and obligations being tracked in inconsistent ways and in manual ways on spreadsheets and other forms. Invoice payments are largely, as I call it a $1 trillion honor code, because by and large, there is really no ability to mathematically curate an incoming supplier invoice. So the payments are therefore made based on the data supplied by the supplier, which is not necessarily in conformance with their actual performance. And then, of course, the relationship side of things tends to be very subjective in nature. Case in point, you can frequently encounter situations where the objective indicia of performance is very high, meaning the supplier is really doing a good job, but there are underlying reasons why the client feels that they're not getting their money's worth. So the relationship side of things is out of sync with the performance till you reconcile the hard data. Next. So these are some of the signs. And then a more holistic approach to post-signature management, as Andrew was pointing out, starts really after signature. And if you look at the second side of this quadrant, under the contract management slice, you will see this is where things become interesting. And if you take a kind of a broader approach to the contract, moving away from the legalistic summary of the T's and C's and focusing more on the language of business and the language of outcomes, starting with capturing the obligations inside the contract, the service levels, the rate cards. These are the really expressive, if you will, mathematical objects. And then moving into the performance area, and as Andrew mentioned, starting to make the contracting system or backbone connect and talk with the sources of performance data. Those could be service request systems like ServiceNow or Remedy or Maximo, or they could be project management tools like Clarity or MSPP, or logistics shipping registers where the performance data resides. Once those sources start talking to the contract repository, it becomes possible to then dynamically contrast what's happening versus what was supposed to happen, with the result that in the invoicing stage, we are able to use that delta between the two to audit the supplier's invoice, finally on a more scientific basis as opposed to the subjectivity. And similarly on the relationship side, bringing on board things like issues, action items, disputes, claims, and even governance body discussions into a centralized repository enables us to get a more scientific view of responsiveness, of time to closure, in fact, of the overall tone and attitude of a given supplier versus other suppliers and so on. And with the net result that we get a much more holistic view of risk and compliance than a narrowly GRC type of view. The traditional GRC tools that are in the market today focus mostly on regulatory compliance, whereas this kind of a window where you're listening closely to the conversation with the supplier in relationship, where you're understanding the granular view of performance and of contracting and finance, gives you a much more rounded view of the overall risk and compliance story within the relationship. So how does this all happen? From an authoring perspective, as Andrew mentioned, our objective is to minimize legal risk and to specify the intended business outcome in as efficient a manner as possible. Once that's done, the storage of the contract is itself quite an interesting thing. Most traditional CLM repositories are designed in such a way that the contract is the pivotal object inside the repository. This, to my mind, makes no sense at all, because viewed from an enterprise's perspective, the central asset of the enterprise is the supplier, is the relationship with that supplier. And furthermore, one can have more than one contract with a given supplier. In fact, one can have dozens of contracts with large suppliers like IBM and Hewlett-Packard. So therefore, foregrounding suppliers and then hierarchically arranging contracts with them in such a way that one can see all the active documents hierarchically arranged, for me, is the logical starting point of any repository. And then, of course, as Andrew mentioned, arranging the search capabilities, both in a structured and an open text way around that. Linked with that is yet another property, which is managing change effectively. Because unlike goods contracts, services contracts mutate roughly 6 times a month, according to available research. Once one has done and planned the repository in this way, one can then turn to the expected outcomes, which are embedded inside the contract. And those could be obligations, milestones, service levels, deliverables, and so on. This is the language of what was expected from the supplier. Similarly, on the financial side of the contract, there are embedded computational or mathematical objects, such as base charges, rate cards, service level credit formulae, earnbacks, KPIs, and so on. And what is really important is to be able to extract these objects from the contract and convert them into algorithms which can automatically converse with the performance data as it comes into the system and give you a live picture of what was done, what was not done, and how much is owed to the supplier. And this then, of course, will enable us over time to address the key risks, whether they are from a regulatory or from an operating perspective. Next. The smart repository inside Sirion, I just thought I'd give you a few images of what a modern repository looks like. So if you look at the image on the left-hand side, you'll see what I was talking about earlier. In the green bar, the pivotal object is Computers America Limited. That is the name of the supplier. Beneath that, hierarchically arranged are all the contract documents. And on the right-hand side, the moment you select any contract document, you start to get all the basic information about that particular supplier. So this is what I meant by foregrounding or pivoting the contract documents, both in a hierarchical way, but predominantly around the supplier in question. Now, if you look at the image on the right-hand side, this adverts to the second point I was making. Here we have moved away from trying to summarize the T's and C's inside the contract, and we are now trying to focus on what the supplier was actually supposed to deliver. And if you look on the right-hand side, those are all the expected obligations and deliverables from the contract, and the highlighted one, which is in a blue box, corresponds to the blue highlighted text on the left-hand side of the screen. This, if you will, is Sirion in action. We have brushed the contract against the grain and zeroed in on the tangible expected outcome and are now seeking to bring it to life. The first step, of course, is to see it in the way you just did, which is in the form of a list. The second step then is to convert each of those obligations into workflows. And this is a very interesting point, because the moment you convert any obligation or deliverable into a workflow, you come up against an age-old design barrier in contract management. Fundamentally, because of their legal ownership, contract management systems were always designed as back-end and highly secretive systems for the use of only one company. But the reality is that contracts are between two or more parties. And if we want to bring those obligations and outcomes to life, one must allow both the parties to work together collaboratively. This means that contrary to traditional wisdom, the counterparty must gain access to the system even after the contract has been signed and be able to tangibly and visibly perform their portion of the obligation and be able to then see that recorded within the system. So this is the first major design or architectural evolution, if you will, that was envisioned inside Sirion, that really the system should operate like a network. Every supplier should be able to log in, see what is expected from them in the form of obligations, and then use the workflow capability of the system to perform their work online in such a way that progress is visible to both parties. The second then is to use the algorithms to automatically measure performance and ultimately audit the invoices. And as Andrew mentioned, in the mature stage of deployment, the conversations start to magnify and you start talking to the ERP systems to look at what the anticipated budget was, what the actual spend was, what the fixed and the variable spend was. And this starts to give you a three-dimensional picture, not just of a given supplier, but of a spend category or of a region or of a function, and really enable you on your fingertips to slice and dice your overall spend information in a very meaningful way. So next. So those, if you will, are the key elements of bringing the contract to life. And then if you do a good job, this is sort of the kind of information you can start seeing. You can start looking across various categories of suppliers and seeing not just their current service level or KPI information, but they're trending information over time in each important category. You can start looking at individual invoices arriving from those suppliers on the right-hand side and be able to interrogate each line item within those invoices and see what was actually performed, what remains to be performed, and so on and so forth. So next. So these are examples of some of the benefits that one can experience in a mature environment. And going further into analytics and insights, for example, if you look at the image on the top right of the left image, that is showing you the aggregate supplier performance across the world in the form of service levels and KPIs. In the middle, the two green dots, one yellow and red dot, is showing you how suppliers are performing in discrete categories. And if you click on any individual category, it will show you the subcategories within that and how the suppliers are performing within that. So this ability to navigate from the general to the particular, which is the hallmark of great insights and analytics platforms, becomes enabled when the enterprise systems start really talking to each other in this kind of enlightened conversation. Similarly, you can start looking at performance in a geographical scale on the bottom left of that side. Or if you are, and this is all very useful information for a top-level executive inside the firm, but if you are a contract manager managing an individual supplier, and you look on the right-hand side pane now, you will be able to see all the individual actions and meetings and obligations that you need to do on a calendar view. That calendar view can then integrate with your Outlook or other calendars and enable you to, correlate your activity with the stuff that you're supposed to do coming out of the contract. Similarly, you'll be able to get a very granular picture of the individual engagement and the trending of the supplier's performance across a set of, multiple set of criteria, as you can see on the bottom of the page as well. So this is some of the benefits that one can experience once one moves into the more mature phase, as Andrew puts it, of contract management, optimization, and realization. And if you look at some of the observations coming in from Sirion's clients, you will see that they feel that they have more than recouped the investment that they made in doing this kind of a exercise fairly quickly, within deployment. So the good news of this, and in fact, this is a question often asked by CFOs to general counsels or to contract managers, saying, how do you build a business case around expanding the expenditure or giving increased attention to contract management? And I think this kind of approach, which ties the performance of the supplier to the invoicing process, really enables us to answer that question in an effective way. Next. So this, if you will, is the kind of broad journey that we have experienced, over the last several years in rolling out Sirion, and broadening the engagement away from a narrow legal discourse to the larger business discourse, if I can put it this way. And this is the only probably addition I would make to the points that Andrew had said, which is that the first part of contracting, which is authoring, is very focused on managing legal risk. Legal risk by its very nature is tail risk, catastrophic risk, the risk of unlikely events being forecasted and managed in advance. And while that is good and always important to manage, the other part of the contract, which delineates the anticipated business outcomes, is equally important. And much of what happens after the signature, to Andrew's point, is about bringing that other submerged discourse back to life. So I hope that some of these charts and insights have been useful for those of you dialing in today. And we once again thank you for very much for your time. And I think we would now like to probably open up this session for Q&A. So back to you in this.
All right, thank you, Ajay. That was quite insightful in terms of giving an overview of Sirion. We still have around 8 to 9 minutes left in the webinar, and I have almost 15 or 16 questions queued in, very interesting ones, and I'm going to lob it to you, Ajay, and a few to Andrew. Let's just start by the first one, and probably Andrew could take a stab at it. Maybe Ajay help us out as well. So the first one is coming from Ranjit. So the question, Andrew, is that very frequently, many stakeholders ask this question, hey, is there an ROI in implementing a CLM tool? Not in savings, but from reducing their direct cost and resources and effort. So how do we measure this?
Yep. Definitely there are direct savings from CLM solutions in terms of that those resource costs. Now, you can identify these really in two major categories. One are the costs associated with actually accessing the contracts, and that you can calculate in terms of if you have an existing contract for contracts and filing cabinets, there are costs you can document in terms of the staff cost to go to that filing cabinet, find the contract, pull it in response to a phone call, and then ship it out. And that's a documented savings that you can do. But the other major, and in fact probably the biggest category, is the legal cost savings. Without a CLM system, you will have lawyers involved in drafting the contract. You have lawyers involved in reviewing the contract as it goes to negotiation and signing off at the end of it. And in each of those cases, you can quickly define how much time is legal being spent on a per contract basis in terms of the creation of the contract, how much time is spent in terms of reviewing the changes that have been proposed, and then doing the final read-through. And then what's the hourly rate? And it's very common that that rate is going to be $5,000 to $10,000 per contract. CLM can take that cost down dramatically by 90%. So those are two direct benefits that you can get simply in terms of providing improved access by relevant stakeholders to the contract system, both in terms of finding contracts and in terms of generating new contracts.
Great, super. Thank you, Andrew. Probably an add-on to the same question coming in I'm just reading it out. There's a lot of discussion around digital transformation, and knowing that the IT budgets are relatively flatter compared to earlier years, 1 or 2% is what additional allocations are. Where do you think, Andrew, the contract management stand in a CIO's priority list?
Well, there are two things to remember. One, many contract management solutions today are offered as software service solutions. So the initial cost of that is going to be the first-year subscription cost, and after that, it's paid for on an ongoing basis. So that does reduce the cost of it. But it's also worth noting that only a portion of the expense of this is actually borne by the IT department. For example, a large part of the cost associated with implementing CLM comes in the form of the time it takes lawyers in the legal department to assemble the standard library of terms and conditions that will go into the contracts, to assemble the rules as to which terms and which clauses go into which type of contract, and to set up the workflow and the approval routings for what contract terms can be changed or can't be changed during negotiation, and who has to approve those. Those are not technical costs. Those are legal costs that need to be factored in, but since legal is the beneficiary of that, that's theirs. There are other costs, of course, of importing contracts in. Again, not legal costs directly, but the cost of bringing the contracts in an appropriate form and tagging them, having them structured with metadata tags. The right tools in the product can make it a lot easier, but there's a human cost on that. Where the IT really gets involved is when you start integrating the CLM system into the contract, into transaction systems. And here, since the beneficiaries of that are going to be the procurement department, it's a CPO who really ought to be making the case that by integrating your purchasing system or sourcing system into our CLM system, we'll actually achieve better compliance of the negotiated savings we got. And again, the CIO is the one who may be saying, here's the cost and driving implementation, but the CPO who should be in building the case that this makes sense and putting that together.
Great, fantastic. The next one is for Ajay. A little bit more deeper into Sirion's differentiation with CLM. So let me just read it out. So Ajay, it's not clear how Sirion compares with a CLM tool. What's the differentiator? Can you explain, please?
Absolutely. And if it's possible, I'll request DJ to go back to the lifecycle slide with the circles. A traditional CLM tool focuses mostly on contract drafting, negotiation, and signature, leading into a modern repository, as Andrew put it, which is searchable. Sirion's focus really starts after the contract repository and goes into areas of administering that contract, realizing its anticipated outcomes on the performance side and on the relationship side, and then ultimately on the financial side as well. So this really, if I can put it in a very simple way, is extending the language of the contract from a narrowly legalistic view to a broader business view of the contract and its expected outcomes. And as Andrew had noted earlier, this becomes especially critical in the context of complex services contracts.
Got it. That's great. So let me just put another add-on, and this is a question coming from Rajesh. So he says, I saw computational objects and expected outcomes in one of your slides. What are these and where are these coming from? Is it coming from a contract or something which your system generates?
Very, very, very interesting question. In our initial research before we started the company back in spring 2012, when I was an entrepreneur in residence at Stanford University, we started looking at contracts with people from the computer science department, from the business school, and from the law school. And what we found is that there is a recurring set of patterns, no matter how an individual contract is written or structured, there is a very decisive pattern of embedded mathematical objects inside the contract. And these take the form of service levels, of KPIs, of KPI penalties or service level penalties, of earnbacks, of ARCs, ROOKs, price books, rate cards, resource unit formulae, and so on. And immediately the question then became, even though these were not expressed as algorithms in the contract, but as simple mathematical formulae, is it possible to take them after the fact and convert them into computer algorithms in such a way that when the conversation happens with performance data, they can automatically reconcile the performance of the supplier with what was expected in the contract. So this is what we mean. When we talk about the plain English journey in the contract to a mathematical object to a computer algorithm, which automatically reconciles performance and financial data.
Super. Thank you, Ajay, for that response. Fantastic. We are almost at the top of the hour. I want to wrap up here and thank you, Andrew and Ajay, for giving such a great insight into both the CLM piece, the larger industry category, and Ajay on what Sirion is all about, the pieces on post-signature contract management and how you started the company. Before we log off, just a quick sound check around housekeeping items. We will be sending a follow-up email and a copy of these slides, a recording of the webinar, so look out for these. And as soon as you log off the webinar, it will pop up a window which will give you an opportunity to provide us feedback with a brief survey. So we are looking forward to your responses because that makes us optimize as we find newer content topics and, of course, great speakers in our next webinar. So we are almost at the hour. Thank you for attending And thank you again, Ajay and Andrew. All of you have a fantastic day. I'm looking forward to my sunny Northern California weekend. Bye-bye.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.